former minister and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Fransson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Tonight's episode, Restoring Faith in Science, with Jason Persoff.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Fransson. I'm here with co-host Jill Surik. Welcome back, Jill. It's been a while since we've seen you.
Thanks.
So good to have you back with us tonight. And also returning to the show is Jason Persoff, MD, also known as the Snowflake Guy. We had him here a few weeks ago to talk about his photography with snowflakes, and that original idea for the show blossomed into a show that talked about his day job, which is as a go ahead, tell us what that exactly is, Jason.
I'm a hospitalist. I'm an internal medicine doctor who takes care of people once they come to the hospital and cannot go home on the same day. So that's where I come in.
So one might ask, what do snowflakes and hospitalists have to do with God and religion? After all, this show is Created in the Image of God. And what's this show title? Restoring Faith in what? Science. Well, as longtime watchers of this show, we're now episode 41. We have a broad view of religion, one which allows that science and religion go hand in hand like hand in glove. My own take on that is that the twin books of Revelation, books like the Holy Bible, Moses, Jesus, and also others, Buddha, who have come as messengers of God and given us wisdom, given us holy writings and revelation. This is the revelation of a divine being that exists outside of time and space, who can not only write history in advance in the form of prophecy, but can give us as a divine physician, a divine MD, the solutions that are needed to make us healthy, not only as individuals, but as a society. But equally important, that same author has authored an even greater revelation, and that is the creation itself. Everything that exists, everything that we can see, everything that we can understand comes from that same source. And so why would the Bible and creation not be in absolute and complete harmony? Why would they not reveal the same thing? Which is why I invited Jason to come the first time with his just amazing snowflake images. However, as we move forward as a species, I often joke that science has assumed the role that religion used to have of doomsday prophet, right? Pestilence, the coming climate change that's going to wipe out our species, asteroids from outer space. These are the things that science, or at least the media, tell us about science that have taken on the role of driving the fear of God into people. So in recent years with the pandemic, we've had a lot of people who have are up in arms about the way that science is now approaching our global civilization and societal problems across the nations. So we're very glad to have Jason here as a hospitalist and with the perspectives that he shared on the show previously. And we also are so happy to allow Jill Surik, who has been a co-host on the show, to show some of her expertise as a registered nurse. We promised that we would have Jason back on the show and that we would push back a little bit on some of the things that were presented, and here we are. Very, very excited about tonight's show. We also have a few surprises for you, so stay tuned. What I want to do to start with, though, Jason, is circle back on something we didn't really get to talk to you that much about, which is your third side job as a comedian. And you'd shared some of your humor. You had also told me that you had been apologizing to some of your patients some of the time, which caught my interest. For if there was ever something that wasn't 100% the way you would have wanted it to go. So I wanted to ask you, how does humor play in to that sort of bedside manner in your case, or your working with patients? And is laughter the best medicine, or is there some other angle that has led you to this field of humor?
Well, humor's there's different types of humor, and I think humor can be destructive and harmful, and can cause pain and suffering. It also can be a communal experience. And if you look at like apes and chimps and stuff like this, they also have senses of humor, and it's fascinating to watch. But I think that humor can lighten the mood. When I make a mistake, it's not usually very funny. But it can be. I think that one of the things that I'm pretty good about doing is taking the temperature in the room and sort of gauging what a patient or family needs. And very often when I bring humor to the situation, it's to kind of take some of the edge off of what usually is a very serious discussion, or to help acknowledge the many things that particular patient is dealing with at the time.
Well, and that's actually why I wanted to open with humor on this show, because for the audience, as we were going over the show in the studio before the show, we have some different perspectives among the three of us and the guest that we're going to be having on a little bit later. So, Jill, tell us a little bit about your experience as a registered nurse, and again your sort of take on that bedside manner, because what we're going to explore is both the science, but also the nature of the individual, and even the matter of faith, i.e., the placebo effect, if you will, in science. Jill, what's been your experience in working with people one-on-one as a nurse, and how you go about providing not just your medical experience, but the value in that one-on-one relationship?
Sure. I haven't practiced for, quite a while because I'm busy raising kids right now. But for me, I try to connect with each person, very similar to what you were saying, Jason. A lot of times people aren't heard. I feel like they're not heard. And so, if they have a misconception or they feel like somebody's not listening to them, try to connect with them, so really listen to them. And even if they're way out there in what they're thinking, that's how they feel. So you have to try to help them the best that you're able to help them. So for example, during the pandemic, I had a close friend of mine who flat out refused to go to the hospital, does not want to have anything to do with it. He had an experience that was awful for him, and he wouldn't go. His O2 sat at one point was at 72%. In my experience as a nurse, your oxygen saturation goes below even 90. I would recommend going in, especially if you're healthy and, it's typically 98 or 99 or whatever it is. He could barely talk, but I had to help him and connect with him and get him what he needed by honoring his wishes. And that's hard, right? It's really hard. But I think I'm really good at it. I was really good at it. So I guess that's how I treated each one of the people that I took care of. He did get better, by the way. He's great. So, yes.
Thank you, Jill. And also Jason, what I want to do for the next bit of the show here is segue into a video, kind of out of left field, but one of the things that we covered on the last show that you and I were in violent agreement about was the media, right? And how the media had not necessarily, to put it mildly, handled their role in the pandemic in the best way. What's the media called? It's like the fourth estate, right? In America, in the American country, the fourth estate. We get the balance of power between the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branch. And then the fourth estate is the media, because they're supposed to accurately report out on the information. And in a democracy, we need access to information. Now, the scientists in their ivory towers and in their laboratories and in their observatories, they are working full time with information in the form of data, right? And they're deep in it, and they understand the complexities of it and whatnot. So in a society like the United States or Western society, or even the global community, that information needs to be disseminated out. I'm a longtime subscriber to Scientific American magazine, and I read every issue. There are some articles I'll skim over, but I have just a curiosity, and that keeps me at a certain level of understanding that helps me have a different view of what's going on. The media plays that role for many Americans. So do you want to just maybe provide a couple of opening comments, continuing on the theme that you raised, or that we raised together in the last show, on the role of the media in recent years in the pandemic and the response to the pandemic?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is very concerning to me is that that the media tends to gravitate towards sensationalism on either end of the spectrum. And unfortunately, in the need for scientific literacy in our country, we need to present things scientifically. And there's a reason to do this. First of all, any reasonable approach to something as complex as medicine or physics or anything else like this needs to be explained in context. But what we end up getting are the really nice, beautiful sound bites. I was interviewed several times really early on in the pandemic, because part of my job is I'm the assistant director of emergency preparedness for the University of Colorado Hospital, which means disaster medicine is sort of my thing. And early on when that happened, I was asked lots of very, very good questions by media. And then when I'd hear the soundbite that they chose, which was somewhere between the middle of one sentence and the middle of the next one, it just felt like all context was lost and the ability to expand upon the important nuances was gone. So the reality is also human organisms as a whole have very short attention spans and want easy answers. And when it comes to science, I don't think that when you go to a church sermon, they sort of just skip to the highlights, the too long didn't read bit. They're like, Exodus, he eventually got there. I mean, I don't think I'm just thinking that's probably not the way that we're supposed to approach things.
It's hilarious. Go. I got to interject here because I'm a former minister, right? And the particular denomination that I was a part of, I literally used to give 90-minute sermons.
Sweet Jesus.
And there was
you could do it though.
And there was a minister, there's an evangelist in our denomination. His name was Gerald Waterhouse. And he traveled around the world to all of the congregations with messages that were felt to be very important to the denomination. He was known for going 4 hours. And some of these sermons would, because of his travel schedule, he would start at like 6 p.m. and go till 10. And you read this story in the Bible about Paul, I think it was, in one sermon, and somebody fell asleep and fell out of the window, during his sermon. And there was this one of the miracles, right, that he wasn't harmed. So yeah, the attention span since those days, it's gone off a cliff. It's gotten worse, not better.
And yet we pander to that. And I think that the media panders to that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with sound bites in our own personal lives, whether people are on social media or not. But when it comes to important issues such as politics and science, and
complex and important,
we need to train people how to think, and that's where education is supposed to come in. But in fact, the majority of the United States is not science literate. And what happens when that occurs, when we have a non-scientifically literate populace, and you espouse something, you get an expert as a talking head on a show, and even me when I was doing that, it doesn't allow for the experience and the breadth to approach a complex issue to give nuance to it that science allows for. And so I think the media did an incredible disservice during COVID. It chose sides, it divvied up, it didn't approach things in all the way it was actually being done in scientific circles. And I think, unfortunately, really allowed either the suspicion that there was a great mechanism underneath all of this that was a big conspiracy to flourish, or that good science that was out there and available was pushed aside because of eagerness for a quick fix to a pandemic. No pandemic in history has gone less than 3 years, ever. If you look back, it was going to be 3 years the moment we started. And people were hoping. I mean, we had a president who thought we'd be done by April, starting in March.
Well, they minimized it, and then they increased the fear. Like it was all
exactly
kind of
right.
I agree with that.
So it's interesting. You open the show by saying that, scientists lead to fear. I don't think that's ever really what scientists are trying to do. And I think part of your description of the sort of the apocalypse predictions that are produced by science are not meant to be displayed as doomsday. They're meant to show they're very neutral. Like when it comes to the global warming literature, it's not everything's going to go to hell if we don't alter our path.
But they say that though, right? I mean, the media says that we're going to right?
Who are they? Who are they? We, all of us, the collective we say that all the time. They.
I'm referring to the media. I'm referring strictly to the media.
Me too.
Because we just evolutionarily, we're very emotional creatures and we make emotional decisions. We don't make clinical decisions.
Speaking of emotional, I'm going to throw a name out there, Dr. Fauci, right? When he refers to, because he often refer to the science.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not even that comment. I don't want to go quite that far yet, but did he not often refer to the science? Would you consider Dr. Fauci to be a scientist?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So he is a scientist, and yet he himself, in his role as a very visible, top, preeminent scientist, was his approach not part of the problem? And as much as I'm not trying to put him down right now. I'm not trying to.
I hear what you're saying.
I'm not trying at this point in the show to brand anyone as a Satan.
Right, you're saving that for later. I understand.
Exactly. Not and actually not at all, but that's a good one.
Just kidding. Sorry. Go ahead. It was just you can't leave that right there and not
exactly. No, that was brilliant.
Thank you.
So Dr. Fauci, did he not do a disservice to the science that he was claiming to represent? And why is that? Why would that happen with such a presumably brilliant scientist and brilliant politician and brilliant speaker? What happened?
So I think one of the problems is in any technical field, when you get to a certain level, you don't ever really speak English again. So, and I mean that in all seriousness. So one of the things that's really interesting is mostly I teach residents who've finished most of their training and are now getting their specialization in internal medicine. And they all start as wee little medical students. And when I have a medical student rotating with me, I have a hard time trying to figure out how to communicate very complex information so that they'll understand it. And I end up taking a lot of shortcuts. And the reason is that I can turn to one of my residents and spew something out with no problem. That one of the beauties of medical science, and I'm sure it's true in all the sciences, is the beauty of the words in science are they're extraordinarily precise and they carry a great deal of weight and consistency, which is not true for most of our normal speech. So, when somebody tells me they had walking pneumonia, I know what they think they mean by that, but I have a totally different view of what pneumonia means. And when I apply nuance to that, explaining that to somebody else, it's lost on them. And then when they try and explain to me, basically what happens is you take somebody like Fauci, who's absolutely brilliant. I mean, most people don't. He was the guy who figured out HIV. He was one of group scientists, and he was one of the first in the world to recognize HIV for what it was. By the way, that was the second pandemic that most of us have ever experienced. We forget about it now. Anyway, being that
your audio is cutting in a little bit in and out there.
I'm sorry. Where did you?
Cutting out just a little bit.
Am I okay now? I'm getting good signal here, so hopefully you can hear me.
You're okay. You can. You were mentioning Fauci and HIV, but the HIV cut out.
Oh, okay. So Fauci,
just make that last point again.
Yeah, definitely. So Fauci, most people don't realize, was one of the major scientists to discover and figure out HIV. He made a number of serious leaps and that allowed us to understand who HIV was affecting and how it was affecting. But like most scientists, if another physician of my rank, basically as an attending physician, talks to me in the shorthand of medicine, I pick up on the nuance. But that's lost. And so I think one of the hardest parts is you really need a good public information officer to provide interpretation skills. People want to see leadership, but the problem is these are very complex issues that he was trying to provide sound bites for. And I suffer from the same problem. I don't think anything he said was wrong. I think what he was speaking as was one scientist to another. And the bad part about that is that isn't what the nation is. The nation's not a scientist. So I never found any of his statements to be bothersome, but I understand why other people do only when they explain it to me. Does that make any sense? I hope that is some sort of...
It does. And I'm not here to whitewash Fauci, but thank you for mapping that out. This is true in all disciplines. I spent episode 40 last time. I spent the entire show talking about heaven and hell, never really getting to it because I was spending time in the Old Testament, just showing that the Old Testament doesn't talk about hell at all, not in any sense. And that people don't realize that the entire Old Testament does not remotely deliver up anything that has anything to do with our idea of hell. And yet in the popular mind, people equate the old, evil, vengeful God of the Old Testament as the one who sends everybody to hell. Nothing could be further from the truth. The concept of hell doesn't even exist in the Old Testament, except in our modern translation of a few verses where there's a poetic reference to future punishments if one doesn't turn and live the right way. But those punishments are temporal. They are in this life. Your life will become a living hell, and the life of your descendants will become a living hell if you do not follow the guidance that is coming down from the mountain. So we're going to cut now to a commercial break. The particular commercial break that we're going to go to is actually what our sponsor, Something or Other Publishing, is doing to address exactly this issue. How can we as a publishing, or how can a publishing concern address this shortest attention span, give rise to a different kind of dialogue, and in fact represent multiple views and further the scientific method, even in discourse and meaningful conversations on any number of topics. While we do this, please do check in the chat, as some of you are doing. We're going to have a giveaway later on. We're going to have more special guests. So please stay tuned, and we'll be right back with you after this commercial break, and we'll dive into the topic of the role of the media.
Your story has the power to start a movement. Journalism is more than a tool for broadcasting news. It's an important way of fostering meaningful cultural relationships that create tangible change in our society. With our anthology Cultural Journalism, you can now do your part and make your mark. From expert writers to passionate amateur, everyone has a story to tell. Our aim is to promote equality, empathy, and create a safe space for different perspectives and interpretations of the world around us. Come join us today and break free from the toxic news cycle by submitting your story to Cultural Journalism at info@soupllc.com.
And one of our neat little features, it also helps with that whole attention span thing. Pull out your phones, use the QR code, and express your interest in contributing to one of our anthologies under the theme of cultural journalism. So what we're going to do now is we're going to play a video with a journalist, Piers Morgan. And I will be interrupting this video periodically to engage Jason and Jill on the topic of what Mr. Morgan is here doing, which is issuing a big mea culpa for his role as a journalist in the pandemic. Watch.
One of the things that, I'll be honest with you, surprised me when I did your show in person. Afterwards, I said, mate, now that we're good mates, how about you unblock me on Twitter? And you went, oh, I've blocked you on Twitter. And I went, yeah, I took the piss out of you over COVID. And that's when you surprised me, because you went, yeah, I deserved it.
Yeah.
I did not expect that, actually, given your public persona.
I've changed my mind on a few things with COVID because the science changed. So I'll give you an example. And I'm quite happy to admit this and talk about it. And people are like, there you go. Well, yeah, because to me, it changed. So I'll give you a classic example. When they said that vaccines couldn't transmit the virus, I said, okay, right, in that case, anyone who doesn't have the vaccine right now represents a clear and present threat to spreading this virus and killing people. So you're selfish bastards, and I'm going to call you out on that. And by the way, those who do have the vaccine, they should have more freedoms because they're not going to be able to transmit it once they've had the jab. You are, and you don't care. Very strident, very emphatic, based on a completely erroneous scientific assessment, which was it couldn't. Now, you might say, well, you shouldn't have said it anyway. I would sort of agree with you.
I would say something else, actually, which is I think that you have a duty to be skeptical. As a journalist, that is your job.
And I've learned a lesson in the pandemic about that. Definitely. Definitely. And I would totally accept that. I think I was too strident anyway. Got too kind of wrapped up in it all. But, you know, I had good reasons for it. I had one of my colleagues at Good Morning Britain, Kate Garraway, her husband was in a coma from COVID. I have 4 or 5 friends and family who lost loved ones, had to say goodbye to their parents on FaceTime in care homes where it had ripped through and so on. So I was very emotionally invested in it. Probably.
So first couple of points here that I want to make, and I want to get your reaction to it. Pierce says, you're probably going to say I was too strident, and then the interviewer says, no, I'm actually going to say something different. You should have been more skeptical. Isn't that your job as a journalist? So the media, largely speaking, became a vehicle for, and based on the overriding fear that was prevalent and pushed at the beginning of the pandemic. And everyone's intentions were good, right? That we have this big issue, this big crisis, and we need to take immediate action. And the media sprang into gear and was supportive of that. So what's your take on that? His statement that Pierce should have been more skeptical. And I'm sure there were people who would completely give him a get out of jail free card and say, no, he shouldn't have been, because that was the science at the moment. And he was driving the behavior that was needed based on the available science. So the role of a journalist in that moment in time, what's your take on that, Jason, first, and then I'll get your take, Jill.
Yeah, I think skepticism is always appropriate. That is the scientific method. We are, the issue is that you need to learn to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And the problem is, I think, again, people were looking for very easy answers, and you saw the extremes that he had gone to because he had experienced emotional trauma. And believe me, I definitely understand that because I experienced that as well during the early phase of the pandemic. So I think that the reality was we didn't really understand much during those first few months. And all we did understand about the pandemic was coming from China. And I think that one of the things that in retrospect we should have been much more cautious about was accepting China's take on the pandemic for what it was, which was not correct.
So let's spend a moment on a slight detour there. And you just mentioned China. Why would China's reporting on this not have been trustworthy? I actually did a search, and for the last 20, 30 years, there have been warnings about China manufacturing fake information and fake data, particularly scientific studies about health. Why? What's going on there? And
yeah.
Why would anyone be trusting China, especially someone like Dr. Fauci? Because you mentioned HIV, and early in the pandemic, I did a little research on the guy, and yeah, the research that was done in Wuhan was outlawed in the United States, and he was instrumental in getting the funding to shift that research to China so that the research that was outlawed here could continue. So if you want to give an inch to the conspiracy theorists, right? There's your beginning. Why would research that's outlawed here in America, why would we have somebody prominent in this who's responsible for outsourcing it to a nation like China, who's known to be manufacturing false scientific studies, right? And maybe I'm slightly overstating it, but I don't think so. And why would, so there's plenty of ground, fertile ground for somebody to say, wait a minute.
Yeah, I think that, and I will profess my knowledge and lack of knowledge. I don't fully understand how what was going on in China in terms of the U.S. funding of research. I don't fully know how that was.
He got the funding to transfer the research.
And I understand that, but what
that's
the
my awareness. That's my understanding.
My understanding was that there were American boots on the ground as part of that research project, and I think that was sort of the safeguard. Now, I may be wrong on this, but in terms of China, it's very interesting. So, as you know, COVID swept through China, and there was what I would call a 90% threshold of information that seemed entirely true when we started experiencing it here. That meant that we were fairly confident that the data that we were receiving was valid. One of the things that sort of tipped us off on the disaster front was in the end of December, beginning of January, suddenly we were hearing information that China's building 1,000-bed hospitals to open in 30 days. And you're like, I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried to build a hospital wing, but let me tell you.
Once or twice, but no.
It is
I remember that.
5 to 10 year endeavor because you have so much approval that needs to happen. Right. And now we're hearing you're going to open that in 30 to 60 days. And we thought, well, that certainly seems unusual, even in a communist system. So when they gave us information that said you need to put these patients on ventilators right away, that was the best data we had at the time, and it was better than no data. And it turns out that through careful research ended up being invalidated. But the reality is they had the most clinical experience. We had to put some value on that, and they were giving us enough information that seemed valid based on the limited experience that we had elsewhere in the world. That all made sense. And so why did we put value in it? Because most of it was correct initially until it could be studied. So one of the biggest problems that we have is, and that happened at the beginning of the pandemic on the social end of things, is we are trying to make conclusions based on very limited information. And I see that Ty mentions that U.S. manufactures information. Well, of course they do. The United States is not pure. We have a whole litany of things that have been done to try and steer us media-wise. From a scientific standpoint, we were working with the best data we had. And I think that's the issue. Why should we have trusted them? Because that's all we had at the time. It took another few months for us to have enough to actually be able to process this through multiple different countries that weren't China. And by that time, it was really too late for many people.
So I want to thank you. I want to have Jill weigh in here on a couple of points. So interestingly, Pierce also talked about what drove his strident behavior were his personal experiences, right? And again, in the studio prior to the show, we were talking that as scientists, those personal experiences are discounted because one's own personal experience is often invalidated by systemic studies and data across many other people. And, stories can be little soundbite stories can be used to sort of completely discredit the idea of one's own personal experience. But Jill, you've also had personal experience in helping some people on the front end of COVID. And I just wanted to have you weigh in on the sort of that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was watching that video, what he was basically, and he was scared, right? Fear on both sides. And I think that's what motivated him to be angry. And if you don't have this vaccine, you're not allowed to have a life. You sit in your basement. That's where you belong. And I think that was from fear. I don't think that, I don't know. I completely disagree with that. I disagreed with it back then. I disagree with it now. And my reasons for that are probably not well liked, but I don't know. I think that's what motivated him. And I feel like, now that we know that the science tells us that transmission still happens, right? We all feel differently. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Are you gonna? Okay. When that happened, I'm not vaccinated. I chose not to get the vaccine because I'm healthy and I'm not at risk. I have no risk factors. And I believed that even though that the vaccine, the mRNA, was being worked on for 20 years, it wasn't out in society. And I felt like it was rushed. That was my personal opinion. I wanted to see where the chips would fall. And I wasn't prepared to do it. So I was in those people, who were supposed to stay in my house, and I was going to kill grandma. I mean, that's what the media said, right? So my reasons are simple. I don't think that later in the clip, it talks about, if 40% of people would die, could you make people would take a vaccine then? Your risk mitigation is so much worse. Like, you're going to take the chance of a side effect or an untested drug. But in my opinion, I wasn't at risk, and the people around me weren't at risk.
Thank you. I want to address that real quick. And Jason, I'd be interested in your take on this. I don't know that we've talked about this. And for the audience, Jason and I have had a couple of conversations outside the show, plus on the last show. So in right around New Year's 2020, I remember at the office where I was working, going up one flight of stairs and gasping and wheezing like a fish out of water at the top of the stairs. And I thought, it's only January. I was active in the summer. I've not been so active now. I'm getting a little older, but this is scaring me. And I also was diagnosed with a congenital heart defect at birth. And I've always been warned that I should stay away from sports. I never listened to any of it. I was extremely active, barefoot water skier, taught snow skiing in the Alps in Switzerland every winter. Very active. I never listened to that, and it was fine my whole life, but suddenly I'm really nervous. So I go to see the doctor, and they asked had I been in China, and we were just beginning to hear this stuff about COVID. And I said, no, I wasn't in China. So they didn't have any tests for it, right? But they took blood, and I had one of those EKG, not just an EKG, but where they take and they use the
echocardiogram.
Yeah, exactly, echocardiogram. And I came away fine, but I was feeling like I was a fish out of water, dying, and it gradually went away after a couple of weeks. Lo and behold, several months later, it turns out that's exactly what COVID did. But I had no flu symptoms, not any flu symptoms, but I am convinced that I had COVID because I was at an event over Christmas in Milwaukee where some people were there who had just come from China. And I live in Wisconsin, and it turns out many months later, we find out that there were quite a few cases circulating, and that they found COVID in blood samples from that period of time. Like, yeah, that's my blood. They found COVID in my blood. But Jason, people were not dropping like flies. The vaccine was extant and spreading before anybody knew about it. When the then president was saying we don't have any cases in the United States, and he was shutting down flights from China for which he was being called a racist.
And didn't they say too, wasn't there, and I don't know, I mean, I read things, but I don't remember where, I don't remember if they're credible, but didn't they come out and say that they actually thought that COVID was here sooner than what they thought that it was?
Well, it absolutely was. True? And what I've later read is that there was some military convention near Wuhan, and that the soldiers, this was in October 2019, that they were seeing and experience that the city was locked down, and that they knew something was going on back then in October. So my point is, this is one of the reasons I was skeptical about everything I was hearing and seeing, because from what I could see with my own eyes and experience in the data, and I remember watching that John Hopkins data, calculator every morning. I would log in and look at the stats as this thing was spreading around the world. Because if I don't have an MD or an RN next to my name, but I have experience as a data scientist. I understand data and how it works in the technology world, not medical data, but data per se. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, none of this makes sense because people are not dropping like flies, right? The death rates.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm talking December, January, February. January, February, right?
Got it.
And I remember the first case that was identified in Wisconsin. I remember from personal experience, the first case, somebody had it, one person had it, and she didn't die, and the hospitals weren't filling up.
No, I remember.
Is there a point that you want me to address?
Well, the point is, again, restoring faith in science. Those who are skeptical, those who are saying, wait a minute, those are some of the reasons they're saying, wait a minute, that personal experience, that personal awareness and knowledge versus what people are being told. And seeing the data with one's own eyes, as I did when I watched. And yet, you heard about Italy, you heard about New York City, right? But
Well, I think the biggest problem with COVID was that only about 75% of people had no symptoms, and this was actually one of the biggest problems that we faced was people were spreading it asymptomatically, and so it's hard to. I think it would have been better if it were the zombie apocalypse, because you would see people looking like zombies, and there would be a high likelihood they'd be asking for brains.
But let's just stop at that one point. 75% of the people had no symptoms.
Correct.
How deadly was it really then?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting question, and it was extremely deadly. So when you talk about
that makes no sense. 75% of the people had no symptoms,
okay,
but it was extremely deadly.
Because
doesn't make sense mathematically to me.
Well, so if any one individuals, so one of the first things I want to tell you about statistics that I loved and I learned in medical school is one of my professors asked me to calculate for a patient a percentage likelihood that they were going to die from the cancer that they had in the next 5 years, which was easy to find.
Yeah.
And then he said, before we go in there, I want you to tell me what the statistics are. And I did. And he said, you know what, Jason? No, it's 50-50. It's either going to happen to this person or it's not going to happen to this person. It's always 50-50. He's like, you can read all the articles you want. For any one person, it's going to be 50-50. So 70% being asymptomatic, you think, oh, that's nothing. But that discounts a number of different variables. And the first is that there may be both a genetic predisposition to disease. There may be where you are immunologically at the time that this is occurring. There may be certain diseases when we found that hypertension and obesity were risk factors for more severe disease. However, one of the things that was very interesting early in COVID was if you were in the 75% club, that was great. But if you were in the other 25%, the numbers were horrible. 10% of those, so of those 25%, if we were not to break it down into the individual percents, you look at the remaining. So if we take 100% pie, 75% are asymptomatic, 6% were dying at the very outset. Now that doesn't sound like a lot. If you're in a room of 100 people, it starts to look a lot. And when you multiply that over 150 million people, this is like Holocaust level.
So you're saying 6% of people that
the
had
initial
COVID,
wave.
the initial alpha. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
very beginning. What we were seeing was up to a 6% mortality in that group. So you had these extraordinary extremes where you had asymptomatic and people just crashing and dying. And what we have found as the pandemic has worn on and pre-vaccine is that number is closer to 1%, and people are like 1% mortality. But let's take a moment and look at that statistic from a populational standpoint. So 1% of the U.S. population is 15 million people, and 15 million people is more than the number of people who died in all of World War II. I mean, it's a staggering number.
Is it 1% right now, or is it?
No, it's gone much farther down. It has gone much farther down.
So when we talk about this, of course, one person dying is too many, right? And if that person is somebody that you know, because we had somebody living on our street whose sister died of COVID. And because of that personalized experience, this person was angrier than angry at everybody who wasn't 100% on board with lock everything down, shut down society. I don't care how many people lose their jobs. I don't care how many children don't get an education. I don't care how many people go into depression and addiction and suicide. Shut it all down.
But isn't that the same side? It's the same coin flipped a different way.
It is.
The people who said,
now, let me
I didn't
finish,
have any symptoms.
Let me finish my point. Let me finish my point. It is exactly the other side of that coin. But as we now learn that the vaccine did not stop the spread.
No,
why?
That's not true. No, you're right. Spread. I'll give you spread. Spread.
Right. It didn't stop the spread. What degree it even helped maintain or control the spread. Given all that, why the insistence on pushing the vaccine on people who clearly are in that 75% or have a 1 in a million chance that there's some unique thing that they're not in the 75%, right?
So I've got an answer for you.
Like
I've got an answer
my
for you.
like my 8-year-old or 10-year who was 10 at the time, whom we decided, we let him help make the choice, but we said, and he said he didn't want to, and we were glad he did not want to get vaccinated.
So the answer to that is that COVID is very unique in that it didn't just cause a respiratory illness. And one of the biggest mistakes people have with COVID is thinking of it as a purely respiratory virus. It's not. Where we've seen COVID cause the most amount of damage, and it has been staggering, is approximately 10% of people will end up with long COVID, which can vary from fatigue. A lot of people think it's been.
You're cutting out.
You're
cutting out. Can you say that again? Yeah.
You bet. About 10% of individuals who get COVID will end up with long COVID, whether they were symptomatic or not. And in fact, the more symptomatic patients appears to be protective for long COVID. And then I can tell you that the problem with long COVID, the ones that we're seeing is cause permanent kidney damage, strokes, heart attacks, and blood clots. Now, all of those are occurring in that 10% group. And so COVID is not just a respiratory illness. And one of the mistakes that I think has been made is to really emphasize the respiratory aspects of this. And that 10% is actually going to, in 5 years' time, cause one of the major healthcare crises that we're looking at because of the number of people who have had early heart attacks, early strokes, and early blood clots and kidney damage. We know that it accelerates dementia. So there are some people who their brain, based on testing, aged 5 years. People with long COVID, their brains aged 5 years based on neuropsychometric testing. So one of the biggest mistakes that's been made in this whole thing is making this out to be just a respiratory live or die issue. It is it is a scourge. COVID is an absolute scourge. And the thing about it is, when you look at the long COVID cases, there is no predilection for who gets it. So you could get it, your son could get it, your daughter could get it, all of them can get it. And it is.
So you're saying the vaccines stop long COVID? Because I know a ton of people that have long COVID that have vaccines.
So it's not entirely clear that the vaccines necessarily prevent long COVID.
Okay.
But
because I know a ton of people that have it.
Correct. But this is the scourge of COVID. So when we talk about these other measures, such as mask use and things like this, the reason we're talking about this is, and why I still continue to wear a surgical mask in public when I'm around other people, not necessarily a big crowd of people. I'm playing dice like everybody else, but the reality is these long COVID effects are very, very serious. And at the same time, COVID has also become much more contagious.
Yep.
Now,
I'd like to put a pin in it. Hold that thought, because we need to go to a commercial break. It's also another appropriate break. We've got another one of the authors from Something or Other Publishing, Elise Cortez, who wrote a book called Coloring Life about the passing of her mother and the last months and years of that life. And I think that's appropriate in this context where even one death is too many. And what can we do in those situations? And we'll come back to this long COVID vaccine discussion right after the commercial break. We'll also be introducing our next guest, and I'll make a prophecy. I'll make a prediction, even though I don't exist outside in time and space. I can't really predict the future. I predict that this show will go into overtime. Stay tuned.
Your story has
As with our other ads, take note of that QR code. If you'd like to get your copy of Coloring Life, just use your phone and scan it now. And I would like to encourage our guests to go ahead and try to support us and some of the authors in this program by taking advantage of these offers.
Yeah, I'd like to see that book. That looks really great.
Dr. Cortez is an amazing human being. I met her years ago. I was part of her PhD study. I was one of the subjects in her thesis, which was later published. And I won't give any more details than that. My name is masked in that study, but I'm one of the 12 subjects in that study. She's an amazing human being. Another amazing
Before we
human
go
being.
on, can I just really quickly go back to just one more point? Really
yeah, absolutely.
Briefly? Yep. So COVID has become less of a fatal disease, but let me be clear about it that as of today, there are still around 1,100 people dying each week in the United States. And compare that to car crashes, which is only a few hundred, or influenza, which is only a few hundred. It is still one of the leading causes in the United States. And if we had a plane equivalent to this, we're still talking about crashing of 3 747s per week. That's going on now. So it is a very fatal illness, and we've grown to adjust to that in our lives, but it has not gone away, and it is not benign. And that's one of the things that kind of bothers me. But the vaccines do reduce mortality and hospitalizations. That's 100% been shown. In fact, one of the coolest things that happened is as the vaccines were rolled out, of course, the Western countries started off with the vaccines first, and we saw an immediate drop off in hospitalizations and deaths. And then as they slowly rolled into each other country and eventually into the third world, it had the exact same effect. So any argument that the vaccines don't protect against death and hospitalization is completely moot. And the last thing is, though young and healthy people did seem to do the best, there is still a significant number of people over the age of 25 who were healthy and died from the disease. I pronounced to myself. It is not benign. It's about making choices, but any idea that we are somehow capable of dealing with this disease just because we feel like we're good. It was a tough time for us who are on the front line. Just those thoughts.
Well, and thank you for sharing that. I'll come back to that too in a minute if we have time. But your last comment about being on the front line, I want to introduce our latest guest, Drew Remignanti, also a author from Something or Other Publishing, who has a book coming out. We'll play an ad for that in a little bit. But we wanted to invite him here because he spent his entire career on that front line. So, Drew, I'll mangle your particular expertise and credentials if I try to do it. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
I spent a 40-year career as an emergency physician and retired in April of 20, but not because of COVID, but because I'd been planning that for a 6-year span. So it was just fortunate timing for me that I got to leave the department right at the time when. But if you couldn't design a better infection to confuse people, medical and non-medical both,
Yes.
Really, I mean, if you said, "Gee, I'm going to design a bug that partially responds to a vaccine," and you're not going to become. You take the vaccine, you're not going to become completely immune. You can still get sick with the disease. You can still pass the disease on to others. Everybody would say, "Well, that's a failed vaccine." Well, no, it's not completely failed because it definitely reduced hospitalizations and mortality, as Jason said. So it was partially effective, not completely.
If you're saying you couldn't have designed a better disease, so you're saying it was designed then in a Wuhan lab. Is that what I'm hearing?
No. Going on to the next segment.
No, not at all. It challenged all of our thinking. It challenged our thinking as lay people, as non-medical people. It challenged our thinking as medical people. One of the amazing things for me, because I was in the emergency department working when this began, was the first thing, as Jason mentioned, was intubate all those people who were really sick early. You intubate early, and then it was a few days, or maybe a week later, they said, no, hold off on intubating as long as you can. Jill, you mentioned oxygen saturation earlier. There was an image on the internet. I could probably find it if you want to email me. Maybe shows this woman searching on her cell phone screen while in the background her O2 sat is at 50%. 50%. She's laying on her stomach.
Yeah.
She's laying on her stomach doing stuff on her cell phone. in real emergency medicine, that person's intubated on a ventilator like in 60 seconds, and I mean,
Well, I had another friend who had silent hypoxia. They
Oh
were,
yeah.
I mean, they had no clue. And I don't know. I just felt like, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to drop off this. You just check this. It just didn't seem right, And then sure enough, I mean, he was a lot sicker than he knew. Again, a different situation, different person, but refused to go to the hospital.
Yeah, COVID
And
was famous for these weird things called the happy hypoxics.
it was-
Patients who had no idea that their life was threatened. Another
Yeah,
weird
I mean,
thing with COVID.
and then you look
overnight
at
he would have died probably,
and then you look at their chest X-rays, and they looked awful.
Oh my God! Yeah, totally.
So
but
not to the intent here isn't to put you on the spot. That's not the intent, but I am going to put you on the spot.
Go for it.
So not with intent, but just because I think this is an important data point, an important piece of information, and who better to answer than you, though I'm not trying to put you on the spot. How many people died by being intubated too early? How many people were killed
I don't know.
by those,
I don't know if
those
anybody
procedures?
figured that out. Probably not. The intubation probably didn't kill them, because if you intubate properly, it's a dangerous procedure if you don't do it right and well. But we're in emergency medicine as hospitalists and pulmonologists. I could almost do it in my sleep, and.
But I think his point is more like not
So
about
the
the actual process,
let
but
me-
actually ventilated.
Yeah.
Let me share an experience when I was actually trying to earn money to go to college. And I was working this is when I was working nights too, Jason. We talked about that. You're working nights. Or before I was working, I was working as a cashier at Safeway. And I was a smart young guy. And this was back in the day when we didn't have scanners. Scanners, that's for wimps. We had a machine that had Braille on the keys. And I was an expert, and I could scan, the cart would come up, and I would already be my laser eyes looking and grouping the cans of soup that were 29 cents each, and my fingers were finding the 2 and the 9 key, and you would push it and hold it down, and it would go ka-ching, 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 as I was moving the soup cans out. And there was this attractive young box boy girl who would stand next to me, and she and I were a team, and we would run 10 times the customers through our checkout line as everybody else because we were so good. And this woman came up, and she had a calculator. There's a point here. Remember, I'm an old minister. I got to tell a story. There's a point coming. And she had a calculator, and she had added up the items in her grocery list, and she said, "You made a mistake. It doesn't add up." And I said, basically, in a nice, polite way, I said, "Listen, lady, I'm a pro. You and your little calculator can pack it in. I did not make a mistake." And guess what? Guess what? Who had it right? The little lady with her calculator. So I push back on that statement. We're experts. We didn't make mistakes intubating people. That was the point.
Okay. Well,
I'm sorry. I'm just saying it's human, right?
No, yeah, I almost killed a woman with an intubation once. More effectively than if I had 2 hands around her throat, choking her to death, or smothering her with a pillow. I nearly killed her. I didn't, thank goodness.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So
nothing we do in medicine is without risk.
And I didn't want to make a big point about that. But Jill, I think you're aware that there were people early on who died that could have been saved had we known more. And I think we could all agree in a detached way with our white lab coats on, sitting and saying, yes, I'm sure that there were some people, with what we know now, we could have saved more people. And probably some of the things we didn't help and maybe hurt. Right.
Yeah.
That's why when we were talking a few moments ago before the break about, we don't know if the vaccines are preventing long COVID. What we don't know is what problems are being caused by the vaccines.
That's true. Somebody said, we don't know the long-term risks of the vaccine. Of course, we don't know the long-term risks.
Exactly. And there's, I've seen reports about there not being an initial, because of the emergency declarations and, the limits of liability in order to roll this out in the emergency, a crisis being a terrible thing to waste. There were not the proper, incident reporting procedures in place for people to be aware of and report adverse effects from the vaccines. So in all this swirl, how accurate really is all the data on this? And one last sort of add-on this, and where I'm going with this, there was a lot of dogmatic statements being made in those early months. Again, with good intent, everybody needs to get on board. People are dying left and right. If we don't do something, it's worth it. Anything is better than nothing kind of attitude, and do this. These things were being pushed and forced on people with limited knowledge and limited data. And we're still sorting that out, are we not?
Yeah, that's true. But I've spent 40 years in the emergency department treating life-threateningly ill people with limited data. And I'm sure Jason has done similar things in the hospital.
And we're grateful. We're grateful for that.
So you have to make yourself comfortable with the fact that I don't know everything, but I got to respond with what I do know.
My question was more, I wanted to ask you on that front end piece with the intubation, but this is really more of a question for Jason on the hospital side, sorting all this out over time. And are these people able, let me ask it. The question that I'm getting at, and again, it's complex. The whole thing is complex. It's a system of systems. But who was that woman that came out and said, what we need is we just need COVID amnesty? Look, mistakes were made. We all were wrong. We all learned things. Let's just forget about it and move on. I think this is far too big to forget about it and move on. But are people too biased and too protective? What I like about you, Jason, is you said, look, I have admitted to some of my patients that I made mistakes, and that's actually a way to limit liability.
It is.
I love that.
Yeah, it's true. And more importantly, it's just the right thing to do. But but I think, you had some pretty broad statements, and I want to kind of circle back to a few of those. One of them you had brought up early on as a dogmatic statement was that, this was rolled out so fast, there's no way for them to know the side effects or that they aren't investigated properly. And that's actually not true. So the first time these vaccines were rolled out was in an experimental way back with the first SARS outbreak that occurred, the epidemic that hit the Southeast Asia area. They were looking for vaccines to fight SARS-1. And actually those were tested in hundreds of volunteers, and they were tracked for years. mRNA vaccines had been used as recently as with the Zika virus down in Brazil, and their efficacy was well documented over many, many years.
Efficacy in what regard? In preventing spread or in
treating disease in a traditional sense. Now, the reason I bring this up is there were, by the time that we were talking about rolling out mRNA vaccines, there was actually at least 5 to 10 years worth of data on different sets of groups that had already had this. So we knew the risk for toxicity was low, but it wasn't populationally low. There is a very strict system of what's called VAERS, which is a vaccine verification system, which you already know and have brought up before. And they did, I cannot tell you, I listed one patient who I thought may have had a vaccine consequence, and I had a whole investigative team breathing down my back. This was an extraordinarily well carried out vaccine, and I can't tell you that the safety of this is there. We have long-term data. Now, will we later find out 2-3 decades down the line that there's something? Maybe. But here's what we do know. This is, again, one of these this really always makes me a little uncomfortable, is when we look at false equivalency. So when I say the term false equivalency, what I'm talking about is people saying this is equal to that. So what we definitely know is COVID is shortening lives. It is causing severe burdens of disease. It is killing patients. And as a population, it actually brought down our life expectancy across the globe. That happened. That was really happening. And we know that. Now, the risk of vaccines, you're talking maybe thousands of people were injured, whereas the risk of COVID, which was killing and has killed millions, people would come in and say, but the risks of the side effects of the vaccine are so horrible, we should have never done this, or we shouldn't have rolled it out like we did, or it isn't valuable. And the problem is you can't look at those two things as being at all equivalent. Yes, some of the vaccines actually had significant side effects that affected less than 1% of the people that had it, and we pulled them from the market. They were pulled. AstraZeneca pulled their vaccine because of reports of myocarditis and inflammation of the heart that was found in usually younger male adults and was found in less than 1%.
Okay, so
and yet COVID causes at least 100 times more common myocarditis, but it got pulled. So, but the thing is, people put them in the same category. They're not. They're just not. And that happened a lot in this pandemic.
Well, let me, and I know I made a lot of broad statements. My intent is not to diffuse and attack on 10 different fronts at once. My intent is to explain the complexity of it because it's all interrelated. It's all interrelated. So I'm not there's we could go on for 3 more hours and we could have multiple shows on this, and maybe we probably should.
Which is what happened last time.
Right. But I want to and by the way, the idea of false equivalencies, I've repeated often on this show. This is my scientific method for eradicating hypocrisy is to talk about false equivalencies and double standards.
Yeah.
Right. Those are two sides of the same coin. A double standard is treating two things that are different as though, well, let's see. One of them is two things that are different, treating them as though they're the same, and the other is treating two things that are the same as though they were different.
Yes.
Right. Double standard, treating two things that are the same as though they were different. False equivalency, two things that are different, treating them as they're the same. That's what we do in our head all the time. That's what makes us hypocrites. We might not realize that we're hypocrites.
But like, as you said, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, Wade, we do this because that's a survival mechanism. You have to make broad conclusions. Like, no one wants to think that they're bigoted, but you make shortcuts in your brain all the time because that's
as a human being,
you know how to put the world together.
As a human being, part of us needs to be Drew and part of us needs to be Jason. Part of us needs to be surviving in the moment on the best knowledge, and mistakes might be made more frequently. And part of us we need to solve this systemically. We need to solve this once and for all. We need conclusive evidence on the best method until, of course, you turn a corner and suddenly the situation's different and you need to jump into emergency mode again.
And as we talked about the utility of science at the beginning, it's not that science is immune to bias and immune to error. We're not, but we're at least every moment of the scientific method is saying, watch out for bias, watch out for bias, watch out for bias, watch out for bias. And if somebody produces a really nice, tight-looking study with a conclusion, people don't clap them on the back and give them the Nobel Prize. They say, let's replicate that. And if it can't be replicated, then maybe we'll try it a third or fourth time, but eventually, if it can't be replicated, it's gone. We don't believe it.
So, what do you guys think about all the medical professionals that disagree with you? I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I'm right, wrong, or in between. There are a lot, and a lot of them they have lots of accolades, lots of experience.
Yeah, honest people can differ, and unfortunately, getting back to my original point about how confusing the virus was. If you decided during the COVID pandemic that you're never going to mask, you're never going to socially isolate, you're just going to go about your life, and you never got COVID, you're going to say, like some people come into the emergency department do, I don't believe in COVID. COVID's a hoax. And we always like to say to them, well, COVID believes in you. So.
Well, and I agree. I mean, the first 3 months we were I get it. I don't believe that at all. But
I'm fully vaccinated and fully boosted, but I'm aware enough of bias to know that that's not necessarily why I didn't get COVID, and I may have gotten it anyway. I may have had an asymptomatic case. So,
but I think your comment. Oh, go ahead, Drew. I didn't want to.
We're at least making a concerted effort. It's critical to science and actually even everyday treatment in medicine. Every time I see somebody, I'm questioning myself, and when I am intubating somebody, I put a tube in, and the first thing I say to myself, that's in the wrong place. Prove that it's in the right place. And then I go through the steps of proving to myself that it's in the right place. So, that's part of the training of being a physician. And it's not something that lay people do naturally. And we don't expect you to do it naturally.
Well,
I don't know if you guys can see this Far Side cartoon. Suddenly the image of the Far Side with its fighting scientists and fighting doctors came to mind. Go for it, Sydney. You've got it. You've got it. Good handle. Don't choke.
You know, here's the thing that I think happened in the COVID pandemic. My opinions are actually not mine. So one of the things that we saw was cults of personality rose up, people with a lot of training experience and background, and they had opinions, and everyone has opinions. But what my approach has been to only deliver the science behind things, which requires me to look at what are broad scale things that have been discovered, and numerous groups have backed that horse. So what we saw was, like with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, which, by the way, there have now been 4 major randomized control trial in outpatient settings and inpatient settings on the use of hydroxychloroquine, as well as ivermectin and vitamin D, vitamin C, and multiple other things that were touted in the pandemic. And every single one of them has shown that there was absolutely zero benefit, zero, in well-controlled randomized control trials. We had cults of personality, people who were pulling case reports of 12 people who got better because they got the ivermectin. And suddenly we had to run on ivermectin. We had a drug that is very useful in lupus and some other diseases
Planquil.
that suddenly disappeared off the market because people thought that it was going to help them. And we had cults of personality, people who were representing themselves, who got up in front of people and announced that this was the case. Now, there's a huge difference between a single scientist who doesn't agree or does agree with the data, but there's a level of quality in science that, and I think Drew touched on it. It is not just an individual, it is a group, and there were lots of guidelines that demonstrated that this was not the approach that we should take. But the TV loves these guys because they're the rogue ones who are going to come with the easy thing to solve the problem in the pandemic. And what they ended up doing was driving a distraction. Also, the implication being that science was being too slow to act, and it was resulting in harm. Science is slow to act because even in a pandemic, you don't jump in on things. You have to expose it to the scientific method. And it was a dangerous time, in part because we were seeing people with very, very strong opinions. Now, the problem is other people are choosing these people to represent these opinions, not because they represent the best that science has on offer, which changes over time based on input, but because they were the most attractive to the idea that there's an establishment that's trying to keep them down. And that was a narrative that played itself out repeatedly, that somehow or another that the mainstream science, and specifically the drug companies, were trying to suppress this information. And it was a narrative that was very unfortunate because it produced an even further mistrust in science. Whereas you had large groups, societies, that spend their time vetting information very, very carefully and repeatedly, who stated this is not a thing you should be doing. And the underdogs, if you will, were the ones who were being glorified. And the problem with that is then you would get the case reports. Case reports are the lowest form of science. They're, I did this and this happened. And we've talked about this sort of specious reasoning, like you were just bringing up, Wade, which two things are not necessarily related. And what was happening was people said, I treated myself with ivermectin. There are some people who still come in taking daily ivermectin thinking it's going to prevent their COVID. And it's doing a number on their liver, but that's not the point. The point is that when people make those associations, the interpretation is the science is wrong. Science as a general thing is wrong. The approach is wrong. Clearly, my Aunt Muriel's second cousin, twice removed's daughter, who found this at the vet company, found it to save her life. And that is the problem we were dealt with.
So I want to, Jill, feel free if you want to jump in, or I have something that I want to comment on too.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So what I hear you and I understand what you're saying. There are some big issues that I still have, some big questions that I still have, and perhaps whether or not other people have these same questions or different questions or similar questions. Maybe the questions are of a kind, or maybe the reason that these questions don't get answered has a systemic cause. The issue of herd immunity, right? And the issue of natural immunity versus herd, because herd could theoretically come with vaccines as well. And why there hasn't been more information and focus on the people who have had COVID, right? So I've been in a situation where with 2 kids and a wife, my wife, by the way, is a doctor of physical therapy. And so she was one of the ones that was urged to get the vaccine first before everybody else, because she was immediate care. We've been exposed to COVID countless times. Our daughter was just exposed to COVID recently, and so we had to go get her tested. The bill came back of $500 because of various tests that had to be done. And 360 of it was covered by insurance, and 140 of it came out of our pocket. And thankfully, I'm upper middle class, privileged. Another $140 spent on a COVID test, essentially, no problem. But for others, it's a big problem. And again, I'm bringing in a bunch of issues here, but never, despite all that, and my wife shared with me that some guy brought in like 15 home COVID tests that were sent to him, and each of these comes with a bill of X amount of money, right? That are just being sent to him, and somebody's paying for this somewhere. In all of this, never have I heard about, can I go get a test somewhere to know that I've actually had COVID?
Yes.
But where is that in the news? Why is that not being pushed? And why early on in the pandemic was there no acknowledgement? And now you can blame the media for this, and maybe that's the answer. Why hasn't the media shared out? You can go find out if you've already had COVID, and if you have already had COVID, this is what it means in terms of your need to get vaccinated or your need to get boosted. You follow me? There are a number of these kinds of questions.
So there's several things there. Let me unpack.
The need question was answered. The need question was answered because it turns out studies were done showing that people who have either been vaccinated or have had natural infection with COVID can still get COVID again. That's been proved.
Right.
And so that's the answer. So
what's
there's
the point of the vaccine?
There's no utility to knowing whether you had it or not because you're still at risk.
And even though you can still get COVID again, go get vaccinated again and go get your booster again.
You're losing. You have to keep everything in mind. The thing you're losing in that rant there is it reduces your risk of hospitalization and reduces your risk of dying. Those are great things.
Getting vaccinated.
Getting vaccinated reduces your risk over. This is why they say even if you had natural COVID, get vaccinated anyway, because when you compare people who've had recovered from a natural infection with COVID to people who've had COVID vaccine, I think the rate of hospitalization mortality of the natural.
Everyone make a note right here. This is the topic I want to get into on the next show. Right now, and we will have all these people back if they're willing to come back. Right now, we're going to go to a commercial break. This particular commercial break is Drew's book, which I'm very, very proud to announce. Our sponsor, Something or Other Publishing, has launched the pre-order phase of Drew's book in conjunction with his show. Stay tuned. When we come back, you're going to be able to win a free copy of this hot new book based on the comment that, and I'm going to say the consensus here. We're going to have a scientific consensus around the best comment for the evening. So here's the ad for Drew's book, which will be available by pre-order with the QR code. Order it now, and we'll be back to give away a free copy and talk about the next show.
The Healing Connection, a partnership for your health. All physicians, particularly those in primary care, are under constant pressure from administrators to be more productive, despite caring for more significant numbers of patients with increasingly challenging health concerns. They also force physicians to spend less time with each patient. While expanded numbers of patient encounters benefit the bottom-line administrators who are constantly watching, the result can lead to frustration and anxiety on both sides, with physicians sensing they may have missed something during their evaluation, and patients feeling their concerns were not acknowledged. This book addresses this current situation in American healthcare, showing how a strong patient-physician relationship can help overcome the obstacles imposed by entities seeking to commoditize healthcare delivery in our country. Dr. Drew Raymanyanti firmly believes this solid and trustworthy doctor-patient connection is the key to superior and more cost-effective outcomes. The Healing Connection is now available for pre-order at soupllc.com. Scan the QR code to secure your copy today.
And there's that QR code for a while in case it came too soon. I want to let everyone watching here know that I'm being ganged up upon. I have the dissenting opinion, and my voice is not being heard.
All that's been heard. We need to get you factually straightened out there. I have all the answers about natural immunity that you were talking about there.
And I look forward to that. We will have Drew and Jason back, and we will dive into that topic. I'm gonna give each of you a chance to give your final comments, because I am a dominant personality. My protestations of being a victim aside, I've had my fair share of talking. We'll start with Jason, go to Drew, and let you wrap up here tonight, and then be looking in the comments as well, because we're going to choose one of these, and you still have time in the next few seconds to get a comment in and win a copy of Drew's book.
Well, I just like to conclude by, I think there's a lot more stuff we need to talk about. The question of immunity is an interesting one. And part of the way COVID works is that it actually kills the cells that make you immune. So that's the reason that the natural immunity doesn't work. It actually kills the lymphocytes that help you make immunity. And that's why we haven't seen a lot there. But there's been subsequent studies that show that natural infection plus vaccination is the single best way to prevent severe disease, long COVID, and other consequences. The reality is that you have to watch. I think everyone needs to be vehement and being careful and concluding a single individual represents all of science. There's a reason that we do a lot of things by consensus, and that science is very slow to move because it's methodical, and it changes over time as new data comes in. And I think that anything that sounds like it's an easy solution or is being touted by one person without being backed by any other society is not the underdog. They're insane. Just so you know, that's all I got.
Thank you. I want to make one comment and to give you the chance to comment back on that. When you say, we need to avoid personalities because any one person standing up, but the easy trump card for that is to stand up and say, I represent the science.
When I share the science, when I'm sharing it here, I am referring to the information that has been vetted by multiple societies. So I am just another talking head at the end of the day, and I won't deny that. But I do base my opinion solely on what has been found over large scale and consistent consensus guidelines and developed data. So it's not just me and what I've done. It's what a lot of people have done and have looked at very carefully and is very vetted. So I think if you can find somebody like me, that's great. But even what I say, the bottom line, I show my work. You want to know what I say? I can point you to all the different guidelines. I can point you to the societies, and I can tell you there's been a lot of very smart people who've really looked this through. Does that mean that they get it perfect? No, but it's the best thing we have, and only God's perfect, man. Thank God for that, because you don't want any of us to be perfect. That'd be awful.
And I do appreciate Jason, and for the audience, in case you haven't noticed it, Jason has an element of humility to himself, and he also has patience way beyond what I possess, right? And so
I have a ton of patience. They see me every day. Oh.
Patience.
And those are two qualities that actually make it not only easier to listen and understand, but to feel comfortable pushing back and knowing that if my questions have not been answered, I will push back, and yes, I will keep pushing back until I get an answer. One of my comments is to anyone listening, do not be a patient. Do not be a patient. Do not be patient with your doctor, right? Drew, that's a nice segue to you in terms of what constitutes a good, healthy doctor-patient relationship.
Yeah, took me 300 pages with 200 plus references to flesh it all out. But briefly, I think it has to be a partnership, but it has to be a partnership that recognizes we have different expertise. Your expertise as the patient is exactly how you're feeling, exactly what your concerns are. My expertise is 40 years of being a practicing physician, having seen, thousands of patients. I did the other day, I tried to do the math. I'm probably 75,000 patients from soup to nuts, a number of other patients that I did curbside consults on. And I did the math. I probably made pretty close to a million plus serious medical decisions, plus maybe another twice as many minor league decisions, like should I go here first, should I go there first? But so I've got some good experience, but I know my limitations. So then we have an exchange where I'm listening to you. Studies show that if you know me to the point where you can trust me, that I'm not going to try to railroad you or get you out the door as fast as possible, and you feel known by me, you're more likely to become involved in your own healthcare. You're more likely to help work on a plan. You're more likely to follow through with that plan, and you have a twice that you do that, and your mortality rate is cut in half. There's multiple studies showing that, which I reference in my book. And the other thing that you'll benefit from is you won't be caught up in that whole medical system juggernaut where you get sent by me, the ER doctor, to get a CAT scan of your chest. They see some little funny ditzel, and they say, now you got to go see this and get that biopsied. Then you have a collapse of your lung because they biopsied this benign thing and you have to get a chest tube. You put in a hospital. You get in the ICU, and you get deconditioned. You finally let you out of bed after they take all the tubes out. You fall, you fracture your hip. You go to the OR to get your hip fractured, you die. So if you could avoid all that maybe by having a doctor who you trust, who doesn't send you to the emergency department in the first place. So that's what I'm trying to address. That I'm trying to recreate a feeling of trust between patients and doctors, which has been lost. And all the forces that have any power in medicine right now are trying to make the patient-physician relationship into the consumer-provider relationship.
Yes.
I've been hospitalized 15 times in my life. I've had 7 abdominal surgeries. I've had a major stroke. I've never once thought of myself as a consumer. And nobody wakes up in the morning and I think I'm going to go consume a little healthcare today.
You've circled back on some things that I was alluding to at the beginning of the show. There is an incredible bias inherent, and with all due respect to the hospitalist here, I forget the exact term.
You nailed it.
Okay, the hospitalist. With all due respect to the hospitalist, it is an industry, and you're a cog, a very, very brilliant, humble, dedicated, service-minded, as pure as you can get with intent human being, but you're part of a system of systems. And again, my own personal experience, I was with Deloitte Consulting until I wasn't, because I saw them doing things that should have been front page Wall Street Journal whistleblower stuff that they were doing in their field around auditing and consulting. Remember Arthur Andersen and the collapse of Arthur Andersen, and a number of the drowning rats from that dying ship fled over to Deloitte because it was a very lucrative business to be the fox in the hen house where you're the auditor and the consultant. Remember Sarbanes-Oxley?
Oh, yeah.
Right? The medical industrial complex, as it's sometimes now being called, is gargantuan, and it feeds itself, and it has a profit motive.
Yeah, that's why it should be socialized medicine.
No, well, I wouldn't go.
End of statement. Socialized
But you can practice conscientious, compassionate medicine within it. It's getting harder and harder to do it without getting fired, but you can do that.
I 100% agree, and my goal became to try to find a way to be that kind of a human being within even the auditing and consulting world as well. Right. I'm not anti-business just because of that. And I don't believe that, business should be state controlled. I don't believe that government, and I don't believe that government is necessarily, so I saw the comment about socialized medicine, right? I don't believe that government is necessarily any better at delivering ultimately better results. that's again, now we have two shows coming up. One that
Yeah,
dives
but-
into the
Yeah, I mean, but look at the free market. The free market is driving a lot of what's happening in medicine right now that Drew's
there's
telling
no
us.
such thing
So-
as a free market. That's an oxymoron.
So it's my
Well-
book is not doesn't say there's any panaceas for this, but I can't change the system as a doctor. Jason can't change the system as a doctor. And when I was trying to get the
Absolutely.
book published somewhere else, I had an agent say to me, "Can't doctors just have some kind of forum where they discuss what's wrong and how to get out of this?" I said, "There's all kinds of forums like that, and there's for a bunch of strong-willed individuals, there's a fair amount of consensus among the doctors as to what should change and in what
Yeah.
way."
Yeah,
We don't.
I mean, that's
We're not
absolutely-
steering this ship. We haven't been steering the ship of medicine for quite a while, So, but what you and I can do is you and I can make our own system. Use the patient, me as the doctor. We can have our own system where we listen to each other. We decide what's best for you, and we might have to fight the insurance companies tooth and nail to get coverage for the thing I think you need. But you got to trust me when I present enough evidence to you that maybe that thing you really think you need, you don't need, like a CAT scan for your chronic low back pain, which got worse when you lifted a box.
Well, but isn't it true that the easiest thing, the simplest thing, is to endless referrals to cover every possible base, no matter how much the cost, right?
Yeah, well, that's definitely a tendency, and that's why if we don't have a relationship, when I say to you, "Gee, Wade, you really don't need that, and let's do this instead," and we'll keep that. We know that that's a possibility. That if things get bad, certainly if you have low back pain and you're becoming an incontinent of stool or urine, or you can't feel your feet, or you can't raise your leg, now we're going to worry that you have a ruptured disc that's compressing the nerve. But short of that, if we can get you on a regimen that improves your back pain, absent those things, and save you the exposure of the CAT scan it really needs individualized. We need individualized medical care, and what the system wants to do is say any warm body will do. You don't need to see somebody with Jason or my training. You can see. I have nothing against nurse practitioners or physician's assistants. I've worked with some excellent ones all through my career, and they just have to know their limitations. You should always have a doctor. If you want to see somebody who does crystal therapy, that's fine. I don't care as long as you let me know. If they have you swallowing crystals, then maybe I might object.
Or smoking them.
Or smart, yeah. But so
All right.
you have to have the captain of the ship of your healthcare, and it has to be a doctor. And
Well, thank you. And Jill, I really did want to give you sort of the last word as
Yes.
somebody
I'm
who
excited.
has
I
that
have
experience as a
something.
registered nurse, and also, mother who has taken your children on many a trip within the system and having your own knowledge and experience.
Yeah, well, I had something planned out because I knew I was going to have the last words, so I had something planned out I wanted to
Excellent.
say.
Go for it.
But to your point, Drew, I recently went to a doctor here, and it was really it was not a very great experience. I ended up getting 5 different referrals that I don't need. I was shocked by the lack of what connection that he wanted to have with me. I'm going to find a different doctor, but
Good choice.
I just couldn't believe it. I was like, wow. Anyways, on that note, I wanted to end with this. In the beginning, we were talking about feelings and personal experiences. So I thought this would be something good to end with. So I was doing a little bit of research. I didn't have a ton of time today, but the latest Rasmussen report says this. 11% of American adults say a member of their household died from COVID-19, while 86% said no. However, 10% say a member of their household has died whose death they think may have been caused by a side effect of COVID-19 vaccines, while 85% say there was none. I just find that interesting that they did a study and that's what people thought. And I thought I would share it because it was their personal experience.
Yeah. Again, probably erroneous in terms of the death from the vaccine, because the people.
But that's what they felt.
That's what they felt. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if you come to me and say, I don't want the vaccine because I think it killed my relative, we'd have to have a lengthy conversation about that.
And we could probably,
Yeah.
but
And if you decided you didn't want to take the vaccine, and I'd have to, would try to convince you to try it and try to show you the data that, mitigates against that.
I guess my point of sharing that is that a lot of people are seeing it, and a lot of people feel like this is happening. And when we say that it's not happening, we're not addressing how they feel. So it's like if
Yeah,
they see it in their husband or their wife or their sister, that all of a sudden they're having all these symptoms that they didn't have the day before, and it's lasting, and it's like taking away their quality of life. We need to figure out what's causing it.
Yeah,
And it
needs to
can't be go away, you know.
No, it needs to be addressed, and it takes time, and that's what the system is not allowing physicians, is the time to address those things. The
Which
more
is back to your
complex,
point.
yeah, we need the time, and the system doesn't allow the time. So we're gonna have to change the system somehow. That I don't answer in my book, but I think that's the first step. The first step that we do have control over is establishing that trusting, known relationship between a physician and a patient. That we can do, and we can start there. And if enough of us do that, we can maybe eventually get enough power. We can tell the system to go screw. You know, that we're gonna.
Well, speaking of power, we certainly had the ability to solve that problem here. We just extended the show by an extra 30 minutes to cover all this stuff.
Well, you're a god in his own universe, so.
We've also, well, I'm created in the image of God in any case. We've also decided we're going to have multiple shows if I can somehow convince and coax you guys to come back on again. I think this is the kind of show that could be very useful for people. Because people do need to have their questions answered. They need to have their fears addressed. And we need to understand and view this from a whole bunch of different angles. We still have one task left to do, and I'm going to exercise my small g godlike powers on that one as well. I'm going to lead you guys down a path. I'm looking at the comments, and I really greatly appreciate the people that commented tonight. But none of them are jumping out at me as being the kind of comment that really I want to give a free book to. I'm toying with the idea of saying, put your comments in underneath once this goes live. So those of you who are watching and have gotten to the end, put your comments in the chat of the show once it's published. And for anybody that was on the list that's listening tonight, the emails that you get to join into the show live, you
yeah, I was going to go with that one. The one
you were going to go that one.
Okay,
saying. Well, I'm very happy to be over.
He's right on the zombie apocalypse. I think Ty is 100% correct on that.
Well, let's.
I'll write a book and send it to you. How's that?
Let's. I'm totally fine with going with Ty's comment, especially if others agree. But let's unpack that for a moment. Even though we're in overtime, that was a comment that we didn't pursue that comment. The comment was related to something somebody said about Pierce Morgan later in the show. Talks about, well, what if 30% of the people were dying, right? What if it was a pandemic that was wreaking havoc and devastation at 10x what COVID did? What then? And Jason, I think you were going to make a comment about something about that, or somebody was.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem was that, you know, if we had a disease that caused symptoms in 100% of people that get it, and those diseases exist. In fact, we're dealing with a Marburg virus, a hemorrhagic fever outbreak going on right now in Africa. And we recently just dealt with an Ebola outbreak where the people who are sick actually demonstrate symptoms of being sick. It changes how people feel about it. It was the asymptomatic nature of most of the people who got COVID that was a problem. And I think that, you know, this is where it's very difficult to convince somebody that that's a huge problem. If you have asymptomatic people going around maskless and going to big weddings and things like this, I took care of a wedding's worth of patients that came from a wedding in Chicago in the late March of 2020, where they all decided that they were going to have this big wedding, and everyone got it. And the father of the bride and the mother of the groom died because, you know, none of them felt bad when they went to the wedding, but it turned out that it was actually the groom who probably was the one who was sick and asymptomatic. That's a hard thing to try and get people convinced of. So it's always nice when emerging infectious diseases actually cause the degree of disease that people would take seriously. It just didn't land.
I was going to make the point that we did have some natural experiments that we could learn from. We had the New York City experience. We had the Italy experience. Those were their experiences were pre-vaccine, but they did lockdowns, they did masking, they did distancing, and they did flatten the curve. So
Yes.
We had two natural experiments that showed us that masking probably did work to some degree. Distancing did work to some degree. And then we had Sweden, who decided to do very little, and they, of the Nordic countries, they did much worse than Norway, Finland, and Denmark did. So because what turned out, the Great Barrington Declaration made reference to this, we're going to achieve herd immunity, and then we're going to all be fine. It turns out that for COVID, probably herd immunity is not achievable because of the mutation rate. So
for the rest of human existence, we will be wearing N95 masks
whenever
we're in public.
It'll be like a seasonal flu, the smart people say. I believe that's not including me. I'm just repeating what smarter people than me say.
Where does it stop? Where
I
does
don't know,
it stop in terms
COVID's
of?
not going to go away.
I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about human experience and human civilization as we move down this path.
Right.
How far do we go? Where does it stop in terms of separating us from each other to protect ourselves from each other?
Well, I think, the last pandemic that required that was 100 years prior. That's where all our data came from, and from managing epidemics. Yeah,
if we do an every 100-year thing, I'm okay with that.
But that's not
that's
at all.
The fear is it's going to become a lot more frequent. Yeah,
that's not at all what's happening, because in our modern day, every other week now we're hearing about the next pandemic. What was it, monkeypox, and then it's something else.
Yeah, but it hasn't. It really hasn't happened, and there's fear there, and certainly there is.
Media.
And is there an increased risk? Again, is there increased risk? Yes, and unfortunately, a lot of safety mechanisms which we had in place prior to COVID were broken down with one administration. But all of that aside, the reality is, if you're asking what's going to happen with the COVID pandemic, we're already there. People have given up on masking, and their social distancing is gone, and there's vaccines that aren't being used. So we're at our new normal. But that's because society has, by and large, accepted the idea that we're going to lose about 1,200 people a week.
I want to do a fake attack on you. You're
going to go left, and you're going to go right.
You just said a minute ago something like, I'm going to try to quote the sense of your words the way it really was, but I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to repeat back what I heard. You said something like the fortunate circumstance of people actually dying at the rate that they were foretold to be dying of. So I know what you meant by that, but you do recognize that is a horrible, horrible statement, that it says it would be good if 30% of people died, because then they would take seriously what we were saying.
Yeah. I mean, this is the reality. No, because I can tell you from experience that this is the case. So even though I've outlined the case of COVID fairly succinctly here, people are still going to walk away being convinced that COVID is no big deal, because the majority of the people don't have these outcomes.
I'm going to flip it now, and because I'm saying that was a horrible, horrible, horrible thing to say, I could now get up on my horse and say, Jason Persoff has said, and I could do a soundbite on the internet, he wants to see 30% of people die so that science will finally ascend and people will take seriously these dire pronouncements of science. That's not at all what you said or why you said it, but you see how that could happen. So what I'm about to say is the exact same kind of thing. And that is that I would like to see a full-on study done of Sweden compared to other countries, because I'm Swedish, right? So I was carefully watching the Sweden model and the Sweden analysis. I completely disagree with the representation, Drew, that you just gave, and here's why. I think if you talk about flattening the curve and all that stuff, and there's debate about why it flattened and was it running its course anyway, whatever, and did that really help? All those debates, and we could try to get into the data, but it's complicated. But if we did a full-on analysis over time of Sweden, and then you get into the question of, did they die of COVID or did they die with COVID? And what was the life expectancy of 80% of the people that died? Had COVID not hit, how long would it? And this is where I'm now getting into this horrible thing, because people could say on the internet, this guy is saying, just let the old people die. Well, in the past civilizations, and I lived in Alaska in addition to living in Sweden, it is true that certain tribes would leave grandma by the side of the trail with a fire when the tribe moved on, and the fire would die out and grandma would not wake up. There was a point in time in societies where that decision was made. People are being kept alive today well beyond their expiration date in past civilizations. And so you get some new novel thing that becomes the thing that actually contributes to their death, because we've kept them alive well beyond their expiration date. Talk about socialized medicine. Up in Canada, we have euthanasia. There have literally been ads now promoting euthanasia. So
we have euthanasia in the United States, Wade. We have that.
It's a complex set of issues within the system of systems that is human society and healthcare and economics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So where I'm going with all this is, again, where does it stop? Where does, a socialized medical system that establishes the standards? You might recall back in the, a few election cycles ago, there was talk about the death panels, right? That are going to decide who's going to die, right? That was the big warning against socialism. All of these perspectives and questions have some reason why people are bringing them up, because you don't ever have a perfect solution. You just have compromises that you make, right?
Well, that one, the death penalty was pure political manipulation. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Of course it was.
Your death panel was me and Jason.
Of course it was.
We decided.
Of course it was. Of course it was, Drew. Of course it was. I'm not saying anything else.
I thought you were asking again.
No, I'm saying the reason why people brought it up is there is a grain of truth to it, because at some point decisions have to be made, right? And do we pull the plug? Do we not pull the plug? Right? So you follow me? So it's a complex set of issues, and this is what I really want to dig more deeply into. What are the systemic, large-scale answers to this? So when we throw out the Swedish study and how it was much worse in Sweden, I actually don't buy it. That's probably its own show, to look at the long-term effects of Sweden versus America or Italy.
Or why you don't believe the data. I think that's even more fascinating.
Yeah.
What data? Show me the data, Jason. I have looked at various sets of data on that, and I don't know what particular studies or what particular data you're looking at, but I do know that when studies are made, there's a particular angle, there's a particular aspect of the complex issue that they are looking at. So what study are you saying, that the definitive study on Sweden, right?
Yeah, so I actually don't know the direct data on that, just because I wasn't asked to look for that, so I can't comment.
Well, then why are you asking me why I don't believe the data, and you've just admitted you don't know what the data is?
Because Drew brought up the data.
I've been read extensively.
Drew,
about
you need to send us the data.
I haven't seen the data. How can I believe the data that I haven't seen? You're asking me to believe Drew because he said it?
No, I wouldn't ask you to believe me because I said it. I would ask you to read some more about it, and if
I have read about it, and I'm way open to reading more about it. In fact, I'm proposing that we dive deeper into it.
Sure.
So why, Jason, would you insinuate that I disbelieve the data when I literally said we should dive into this?
One of the things that you said, and whether you were aware of it or not, is that, this was a thing we heard a lot in the COVID pandemic as well, which was, these people were going to die anyway. I mean, it was mostly the obese, hypertensive, older patients with diabetes, right? So they were going to die anyway. So why are we counting that as a COVID death?
Well, some of them were, Jason. And as I mentioned, I hesitated even bringing it up. The only reason I brought it up was because you had made also a comment about 30% dying or whatever.
Well, what I was saying is I think it's easier for people to believe that when that's the case. It is easier to believe if you know that when you're sick, you're sick. So when I say that, it's easier for people to believe that because they have the evidence in front of them. It's hard for people to believe evidence that is not immediately apparent to them. And this is the problem with subjective experience, is if I don't have any symptoms, and nobody I know ended up with symptoms, and nobody died, the plague doesn't exist. This is one of the experiences that happened in a lot of little towns throughout the United States, because unless COVID was introduced there was no clinical experience. But the problem is, and the reason I made the comment that I did in the extreme that I did, is not because I want 30% of the population to die, but because people only care when it really affects them directly. Then their experience changes. So it's interesting to see how that transformation occurs. But the last thing is, your point about excess deaths is one of the statistics that we actually use. An excess death is a death that occurs when it was not expected. And across the board, when COVID came through, we had excess deaths occurring in all the different domains. And when you say people dying with COVID as opposed to from COVID, early in the pandemic, it was from COVID. There was no question about that. Now, as time has gone on, we are definitely seeing, like I see hospitalized patients who have COVID, and that has nothing to do with why they're there now. But the initial strains, the reason people were dying was from COVID. I mean, that there was no disagreement in the scientific community.
Well, but again, in many cases, and no, I'm not wanting them to die, but I've been in nursing homes. I'm old enough now to have seen a few grandparents and great grandparents die, and I've seen the circumstances in which they are living when they die. And there are X number of those people alive at any time. And when a novel, new pathogen enters the environment, it's naturally going to be the pathogen that is the final straw for many of those people.
Okay, and that may be fair, but what we were seeing was people who weren't on death's door dying as well. I mean, that's the thing. So if you have somebody who is bedbound, demented, and has pressure sores, and you are looking for the straw to break the camel's back, you're right. But that wasn't what we were seeing. We were seeing people who had another 10, 20, 30 years of life expected, and they were being cut off because of the COVID pandemic. And those people, sometimes their only crime was their BMI was 35. Right. So there's that aspect to that. And I think that, one of the things that was interesting that Drew had talked about and was very true is we did watch how severe the disease outbreaks were in those various regions. And Italy it was a horrible, horrible time. I had a friend who's a physician there who had an awful. He was nearly suicidal by the end of the month of March and April because he couldn't help the number of people that needed to be helped, and they just had to watch them die. And that was awful. And I think when it comes right down to it, one of the problems and we've talked about this privately, and I'll share this again, is there was one of the things the pandemic brought out was the lack of compassion for fellow human beings. That if I'm asymptomatic and I don't get the disease, it's no big deal. And yet, during the early pandemic with the early viruses, it was possible for people to kill other people. So what Pierce Morgan, in the interview you showed earlier, I think one of the things that's really key here is people lacked the compassion to take personal accountability that it was possible to actually spread a disease that you don't feel anything about. And instead of trying to help humanity while we tried to figure out the best way to approach it, they fundamentally chose not to do that. And that disregarding actually did lead to fatalities, and not just a few, tens of thousands. And I think the thing that broke me as a human being during that time was knowing that people could have done better. They could have been better. We could have been better as a society. And maybe we deserved this because, as a society, we didn't take care of each other very well there. And that's not something that we've seen before. In American society, same freedoms that we talked about in 1917, 1918 that we have today, same exact ones, with a few others being defined differently. We can still drink now, and then 1917, they were looking down the pike at not being able to drink. But if you look at it, they treated each other very differently back then. The masking was something that just happened. And whether the masking is soft and it only reduces a couple cases, it's not that big a deal. But people made it a much bigger deal. And I know there's a slippery slope, and we've talked about that before, and everyone's like, you take away one right, the next one is just there. But the reality is, the reality is, in the COVID pandemic, not only was the science bad, there was no compassion.
Right.
People did things to try and be compassionate to each other, and those were rare.
So I want to thank you for bringing out that aspect. I think that is probably the most important. And it's a nice summary statement on, again, why are we talking about this on a show called Created in the Image of God, right? The role of religion in society. That compassion, that human decency must absolutely be there. I want to ask, though, because it's so easy to, make assumptions. Do we really have the data on what percentage of people wore masks in 1917? And was the percentage of people that wore masks in 2020 any different? Was the percentage of people that wore masks perhaps similar? I don't know. Have people become fundamentally less compassionate? What I think we can say is that at no time since the Civil War has American society been as divided as it is, in camps, in echo chambers of self-reinforcing narratives, which again is the purpose of this show, is to bring those different perspectives together. And hopefully nobody on this panel has felt any disrespect at any moment in this show, even as I might say, Drew, you better show that to me, because I'm not saying I would reject the data, but you haven't shown me any data. Bring the study, quote the study, show me the study that you're referring to in Sweden. I don't mean that as any disrespect. I am honored to have you on the show and to be promoting your book and the parent relationship, but I have the right to say, I want to see that data and not have somebody say, well, you've disbelieved the data. And I know what I said. I don't believe the narrative around Sweden. I don't. And I can also show you why if we come prepared, and I can then go back and dig up the research that I looked at in passing, because this isn't my day job. This is not my day job. For you two, it is your day job. The fact that Jill and I can even appear on the same stage and not completely embarrass ourselves. You probably think I have embarrassed myself.
No, not at all.
But it's not my day job. And I have done more than adequate research for my own sake, but I've also seen how I've been treated with an utter lack of compassion and disrespect by those who have set themselves up and accused me of being a killer for merely saying I'm not so sure. And they have no idea whether I did or didn't wear a mask or whether I put anybody at risk. But the mere posing of a question allows them to call me a grandma killer.
Yeah, I mean, I think compassion goes both ways, right? So I think, I think compassion is recognizing that everyone's struggling with their own things right now, right? I mean, where I think the line gets drawn is when people do so in malicious attempt or are closed-minded to any other possibility other than what their own experience is. And I think that's where compassion is we're not thinking about ourselves less, we're trying to think of others more. And I think it's okay to have your fears and your biases, because we all have them. I have them. Everyone has them. But what I think happened during the COVID pandemic was people were very directly affected by the severity of what we were facing. And I think it led to a lot of fear and mistrust and anger. And I was part of that. I absolutely was. I got very angry. And I had patients telling me that COVID didn't exist, just like Drew did, which was very upsetting because COVID didn't have any problem existing in them. But at the same time, it was I think from stem to stern, one of the things that really bothered me the most was we had a chance as a society to prove that this is an incredibly great place to live in a great country, and we failed.
Well, I think and again, on that front, I hear you and I agree with you. However, each person's view, I think what bothered me the most wasn't any one individual who may have had a personal experience or a personal bias that led them to react, right? But rather people who seized upon it as an opportunity to drive their agenda.
Well, and that does happen, right? Fear begets, rigidity, as both, as you know, when we're fear-minded, it's about survival. It's not about taking in all the data and accepting things. And like I've said multiple times, we're evolutionarily built to do these things this way, because that's, as a single individual, as a species member, that living off of fear is great, but we actually have a frontal cortex that allows us to move beyond fear. And in many ways that didn't happen because people didn't.
No, we want to use the reptilian brainstem.
Yeah, it's offered the most fun in our lives. I mean, if you think about it, it certainly has mine, or at least my adolescence suggests so, but
Well, and Jason, again, thank you so much. I want to give Drew and Jill a chance because you and I have been going back and forth a little bit, which I can't wait for the next chance we get to come together and talk, because for whatever you might think of my reactions or my statements, I am deriving immense benefit from these conversations. So thank you.
It's always good to have this conversation.
So Drew and then Jill, last comments. Second last comments.
Nothing of real content to say except they did have what they called mask shirkers back in the influenza epidemic, and I remember there was some incident that came down to a cop shooting a guy because he wasn't wearing a mask.
Well, there
I'd have to do the internet search to find it again, but
why am I not surprised?
But they were. I mean, I think that's how few of them were. They were
Agreed.
just basically mass shirkers.
Well, if you could be shot by a cop, there would be fewer.
Yeah. No, but I think I agree with Jason's point that definitely showed that we we're in little silos, and I mean the whole thing was politicized right from the get-go. It would have been an interesting experiment to do to see if it hadn't been politicized so immediately by the last presidential administration, where would things have gone? They would have gone bad.
I'm going to reject that. It was not politicized by one side.
Yeah, the media.
Oh, no, wait. No.
It was politicized by both sides.
Yeah, well, that's true.
More than two sides. I don't like it when people want to blame one side or the other.
No, I have a statement on my book that says partisan politics of any stripe is a public health hazard. So I agree with that.
I agree.
There was only one president who happened to come from one party. I'm not a member of any political party, never have been, never will be. So, but I only brought it up.
Let me ask a simple question. Given what we know, was it a good or a bad thing to stop flights from China when that was done?
I don't even have an opinion on that. What was a bad thing to do?
I see you nodding, Jason.
Another thing I say in my book is that I call it the "I'm not a doctor but" illusion. I'm not a doctor is a complete sentence. Period. I'm not a doctor but can lead to nothing good. You can say I'm not a doctor, comma, so I shouldn't probably say anything more, or so you should take anything that I say with a huge grain of salt. But I'm not a doctor but, and then giving medical advice. Somehow we've come to believe that because the person has that preceded whatever nonsense they're going to say with the I'm not a doctor, that it's okay for them to say any goddamn thing they want. Excuse my language.
So who was it? Dr. McCoy, right? What was his famous statement? I'm a Dr. Jim, not a...
Oh, yeah, I can't remember.
Yeah, not a Democrat. But as the joke that I've heard, but yeah, it was the right thing to do that. The way it was handled, though, was
magician.
Thank you.
Yeah, right there. Yeah, thank you, Daniel,
for saving us. Damn it, Jim. But no, I mean, yeah, it was the right thing to stop the flights.
I'm a doctor, Jim, not a magician. I'm not a doctor, but I am a magician, right?
Yeah.
Well, my point is, I'm not pro or con. I'm just saying, who made that decision political, right? I mean, maybe the decision was political, but it was the right decision, and because it was the opponent that was making a right decision, suddenly it was a racist thing, right? So, this swirl of toxic accusations, there's plenty of it going around on any side.
But I was just trying to make the point that non-medical people should not be giving medical advice. Zero, zip, nada. I mean, again, if you want to say, if you really have insight, you'd say, I'm not a doctor, so therefore take anything I say with a grain of salt, but I've had this experience. That would be a reasonable sentence.
But isn't that what they, I mean,
that's not what they mean. That's not what they mean.
I would assume that's what they mean when they say, I'm not a doctor, but that's what I would assume. But I'm not a doctor, but that's what I would assume.
But then they introduce what they think is a common sense thing. Here's one more example. And again, I'm not anti-Republican. I'm anti-partisan politics. I'm anti-foolishness. Here's one thing that, again, number 45 said. The reason we have so many cases is because we're doing so much testing. Now that makes perfect sense. It's like if we all have that experience in life. When we look harder for something, we're more likely to find it. If you can't
have
find
an
your car
MBA.
keys, if you
I
have,
have an MBA. Guess what the number one rule of business is? Does anybody know? You're not an MBA. See, I am an MBA. The number one rule of business is you get what you measure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, at any rate, so here's how that. So, but I didn't expect him to know this, but he had plenty of people around him who did know it. Let's say you have a rare condition. There's one case of this rare condition in a population. You do 100 tests. You do 100 tests. You happen to catch that case. You have a 1% positive test rate. Now you do 1,000 tests. Your positive test rate goes down to 0.1. And so if that was what, but we were finding the exact opposite with COVID. The more testing we did, the higher the test positivity rate got, proving it was not a rare condition, it was a common condition.
Right, but also reducing the death rate.
Well, I'm talking about, I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Simple math. No, I'm
just saying.
That's fine.
So that statement appealed to our common sense. And common sense is a necessary ingredient to making good decisions, but it's not sufficient. Because in that case, the common sense thing that if you look harder for something, you're going to find it was not applicable to COVID. And we had a perfect way of proving that, which was those stats were being actually posted on the internet, test positivity rates, and that the test positivity rates were going up. So that immediately undermined that I'm not a doctor, but illusion. And,
it depends on what follows the but I get your point. And probably if I were a doctor, I would be equally emphatic about not liking that statement.
That's like, you'll never hear me say I'm not an economist, but because I don't try to address the economic.
Would I hear you say I'm not a biologist, but I know what a woman is? Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Anyway, it's basically speaking out of school in a sense, speaking beyond your skill level. And everybody's a mini doctor. You're supposed to be. You're supposed to realize what makes you feel unwell, and so you don't do it. Your example of the poison mushrooms. I use the example of the.
Are there hierarchies in society? Are the doctors on a higher level than other experts or other people?
No, in the field of medicine, yes. I mean, when I get sick, I go to the doctor. I defer to a higher authority, and I try to listen to him. I learned that the hard way because I tried to be my doctor when I had some stroke warning symptoms. I said that can't be a stroke. You're 38. You have absolutely no known risk factors. Bingo! A week later, I'm clotting off my right middle cerebral artery.
I'm just throwing out lines now because it's very late and I'm getting giddy. Because this is a line for a future show. To what degree are doctors an authority, and to what degree should we as human beings defer to that higher authority?
Within the healthcare field, you should defer, and that's in the Baha'i writings, actually.
But
here's my answer, Wade. You don't go to Midas unless you want a muffler, right? So if you want an allopath, so the thing that tells us everything about it is everybody who's tried all these alternative therapies, when they get sick, guess where they end up? On my service.
Yeah, that's
they
why
try
you don't.
Everything they can to avoid coming to us, and then they end up.
They should. If you can avoid being in the healthcare system, the mainstream medical healthcare system, that's great. If you can avoid it, but you don't have. There's no alternative medicine emergency departments or ICUs. They don't.
The bottom line is, if you're looking for what we believe allopathic medicine has to offer, we'll offer it to you. And very frequently, when people go elsewhere, eventually they need to find their way back to us. But that isn't to say that we are the complete experts on healing, or that we are the ones who help with lifestyle or anything else.
Is it a healthcare industry or is it a sick care industry?
Well, I just told you.
It's sick care, but that's what we want.
Yeah,
in 40 years, I never
want a muffler.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
My job is here to minimize suffering. That's my job. To try and minimize
I never
suffering.
once had a single patient come in to me and say, I'm feeling pretty well today. I just want to know how I can get better. I want to know how I can improve my diet. You come to me, you come into our system, that mainstream medical system, when you're not feeling well. So it is a sick care industry, but it's a sick care industry because that's what we want and demand of it.
But I don't think that makes you a whole human being to rely on medicine. I think that there's other things that need to be emphasized in society, and I think that the shortcut for many people is illness response. I think the longer, harder work is much more complex and comes from many different areas. But if you're ill, yeah, come to us. That's what we do.
Well, let me throw out, and Drew, this may be of interest to you, because I know what also is in the Baha'i writings is that in the future, at some point, food will be our medicine, right?
Yeah.
That's also in the Baha'i writings. So on that note, and I don't want to overemphasize that, but on that note, I've thought a lot about many things. I'm not a doctor, but I have thought a lot about many things.
Oh, no.
I couldn't
Okay,
resist.
go for it. Go for it.
As a child in America, growing up in a family with an alcoholic mother, the TV was often the babysitter. And in an environment where I lacked parental care, Dad was working off in a work camp for weeks at a time, and Mom was drinking for weeks at a time. And, you know, I would sit in front of the TV, and the care that I was given from the and by the way, there's a point here, so stick with the story. I'll even tie in Sweden here.
Wow.
There was, this is how I roll.
You go, buddy.
So
we call that circumferential speaking.
Right. So as I'm watching TV, a hole in America, a hole is being drilled into my very soul, telling me that I need whatever crap they are promoting in order to make me well, happy, decent. A hole is being ripped in my soul that can only be filled by whatever crap they are selling. And realize that as psychology and business merged, the most sophisticated psychological worms in the history of humankind were being developed and delivered through that medium of television. I went to Sweden then in a kidnapping situation because my mother was an alcoholic and my parents divorced. My father kidnapped me and my two sisters and took us to Sweden. And in order to pay for the international court battle that ensued, I was split up between one set of relatives and my sisters with two other sets of relatives. But in Sweden, they had laws that made it impossible for advertisers to advertise to children. In fact, there were two state-controlled TV channels, and there was no advertising on it. So the psychological warfare that was being perpetrated against young American kids was not perpetrated on me while I was in Sweden. This gave me natural immunity. See how I'm weaving that in? This gave me natural immunity so that when I came back to America, I was arguing in 6th grade for socialism because something deep in my soul told me this is a better way. In the middle of 6th grade, I was arguing with for socialism against the American kids who were capitalists. I barely knew anything about what this word even meant. They knew even less, but we could have really good arguments about it nonetheless. What's my point here? Go watch TV today and you will be bombarded with advertisements about every imaginable drug to fix every imaginable and some that you couldn't imagine problems that you probably have. And just get this pill and it will fix you, right? This is the basis of that whole consumer product relationship in medicine. And we, as a society and even as a species, are being programmed to go down that path and to seek out those authority figures. 4 out of 5 doctors recommend this, right? Is on every, that's the old school ad. They're much more sophisticated today, right? In how they get you to buy into the fact that you need to buy their crap, whatever that crap is. And not that there isn't good stuff there, and not that, like I shared, I don't know if it was in the studio earlier, that I almost lost an eye because nobody was diagnosing the condition I had properly. And when they did, they injected my eye with cortisone and they saved my eye. but they had nothing to offer for the underlying condition. I had to go seek my health elsewhere because they were sick care, and I had a chronic condition for which there was no cure. And they were more than happy to sell me a program for the rest of my life to the tune of who knows what that would have cost me over my lifetime had I agreed to accept the permanent disability that I was offered at the time. And so that's just in one example. That's just my personal experience, right? But you see how I've universalized it by paving that path of the programming that we received as kids to go to that authority figure, in this case, no disrespect for any doctor in the room, that authority that will fix me if I go to them and pay my money to get fixed, or give my life, give my trust, give my whatever. Which is not to say that medical science doesn't play a role. I'm grateful they saved my eye. They showed me what I had. They ran the blood tests. We take our children to doctors. I'm not anti-doctor. I'm not anti-science. But the individual human being is still at the center of all this, in my opinion.
I agree.
And that's pretty much the theme of my book as well.
And I'm grateful that we have hospitalists, Jason, because an American hospital is a marvel. It's a marvel. It's a medical miracle.
Yeah.
Of what the capacity that it has, what it can do, the treatments that it gives, but still there's, as the Germans would say, there's a worm in it. There's a worm in it somewhere.
Only if you
there's
choose
a worm
to
in
believe
that
that
apple.
there's a worm.
But it's the profit motive that underlies it. And it's this.
I mean, I think that again, the biggest problem that we have is that we don't have socialized medicine because people don't want to pay for it. Number one. Number two, that just because something is tainted doesn't mean that the whole solution is poison.
I said there's a worm in it. You can eat around the worm. If there's a worm in an
apple,
apple,
it's a lot easier than if it's like free floating in the liquid. I mean, but you know, it's I think this is a lot of good stuff that we'll have to save for next time because there's a lot to be said here.
Yeah,
I think at the end of the day, that we are sick care. What I do is sick care. I mean, people don't need a hospitalist if they're not sick. And I look at medicine very much like that. And I think that, like I said before, you asked about authority. Yeah, I mean, we're held to a higher authority. We're held to a higher level of responsibility. You expect your doctor to have certain skills, attributes, and hopefully
there's that Hippocratic oath thing, right?
Yeah, but most people don't take the Hippocratic oath anymore because it says at first do no harm, which sometimes we do have to do harm.
Right.
You can't have surgery without doing harm. I mean, they're not compatible. But you know, to that point, do I think it has the full answer of what it's like to be a human being? I think when people think doctors are like that, that's not true. But I expect my pilot to know how to fly that plane, even if the autopilot fails, right? And you expect your doctor to be able to manage disease, even if you know whatever you've been trying otherwise has failed. But do I think that there's roles for complementary stuff? Do I think I have all the answers? No. But when it comes to illness, yeah, I feel pretty confident. But you know, people were surviving millions of years without allopathic medicine. Maybe not millions, maybe tens of thousands. But you know, we do the best we can. That's all any of us can ever do.
Amen. And on that note, thank you so much. And for those, wow, that we still have a few viewers here.
Just one person, I think. Just one.
Stuck with us.
Hamstring one, trying to figure out whether.
No, we have one commenter, right?
Oh, okay.
One commenter, but there are other viewers. So thank you, everyone who's still here. Thank you to our esteemed guests. Go out and buy Drew's book or pre-order it, and we will. Oh, so next week, what do we have next week for you? Next week, we have a philosopher, Bill Meacham, and Dan Sampson will be standing in for me as host. I will be the co-host. I will try to zip it for most of the show. That's going to be, you know,
I'd watch it just for that.
Exactly. I was about to say something like that. So it's a nice follow-on to tonight's show. How can we encourage the development of altruism versus egoism?
Phenomenal.
If we can solve this, the system won't much matter. Next week, Bill Meacham on Created in the Image of God. Thank you, loyal audience. glad that you stuck with us tonight, and we'll have these folks back on again soon. Good night for now.
Bye, everybody.